esteemed colleagues, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are joining us from for this interesting conversation. So we are going to start now. I think we have all the speakers and our moderator right in the room, in this virtual room, and we'll be giving admitting more participants as they join us in the conversation. But in order for us to keep to time, we would like to start now. My name is, once again, Omolara Balogun. I work with West Africa Civil Society Institute as the head of policy influencing and advocacy unit. This is the 5th of this type of forum, which we started in May 2020 due to COVID. This is what we call our COVID series webinars. It's been interesting. If you have not been part of this conversation in the past, please log on to our website, www.waxy.org, to read outcomes of previous conversations. And then we would like to hear your feedback, your insight into previous ones, and of course, what we'll be discussing today. Today, we're looking at a very interesting topic, and I'm so excited, not only because of our moderator, but of course, the quality of speakers that we have been able to put together, those that will be sharing insights on this topic with us from across the globe. So today we're looking at COVID-19 and civil society sustainability. You would agree with me, to those of us that are quite conversant with the work of WAXY, that civil society sustainability has been a topic we have been driving for a couple of years now, about 4 or 5 years, because we believe it's important to bring this kind of topic to the fore so that we discuss the future. We continue to talk about the future of civil society organizations in West Africa and indeed across the continent. So today we are looking at COVID-19 and civil society sustainability and addressing the implications of change in donor priorities amidst and post-pandemic era. You would agree with me as well that since the invasion of COVID into our world, a number of things have changed, and that also includes how donor interrelate, fund, and partner with civil society organizations. We'll be looking at those changes and all of that. I will be hearing from a number of people in our midst today. I'm not the driver of this bus, so I'm going to invite our good friend, our senior colleague, Taka Awori. Taka is the managing director of Busara Africa. She is a leadership consultant, trainer, and professional coach, strengthening competencies of managers and supervisors in the private sector, civil society, and the public sector. She has over 20 years experience working on organizational and governance issues in East, West, and Southern part of Africa. Taka holds a bachelor's degree in political science from Harvard University and a Juris Doctorate in law from Columbia University. She sits on the board of African Women's Development Fund, AWDF, and she used to sit on my board, the board of West African Civil Society Institute, but now she's a lifetime friend of WAXY. Taka, we're so excited to have you in this conversation, particularly moderating this conversation. We couldn't think of anyone else to do justice to this. And I'm going to tell you this. When we were thinking, deliberating on who to moderate, I told colleagues, I said, I need an all-round civil society person. I'm not looking for a specialist in this or in that, but somebody who can fit every old. And a number of names came, and I said, no, let's look for Taka. I'm so excited to have you moderate this. Taka, please, you have the floor now. My job is done, but I'm here to support. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Omolara, for that warm welcome. And I need to correct one thing, Omolara. I'm not a friend of WAXY. I'm a family member.
I know, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So absolutely lovely to be here, and good morning, good afternoon, dear panelists, distinguished guests, and participants in this very important webinar series. As you said, Omolara, and actually I really need to begin by congratulating Waxy for having these conversations. It is true, you've been talking about sustainability for a long time, but I think it is critical we talk about it at this moment in this context. I think what we've all recognized is that COVID-19 has been more than a health crisis. What we've seen is over 1 million lives lost globally. We've seen poverty and inequality being exacerbated. And I think a key thing for all of us who are on this call in terms of what we care about is that the impact of COVID has been unequal. And in that respect, many civil society organizations have been advocating for governments to ensure that their responses to the pandemic are reflective of this unequal impact, but they've also been trying to fill the gaps in terms of what government is able to do. So I think more than ever, we need civil society organizations, not just in this region, but globally. And yet the reality is, and I think that's what brings us to the conversation today, is that one of the key elements of ensuring civil society sustainability, the funding has been impacted. And Omolara had shared before this call with me a recent survey by Civicus on the financial impact of COVID-19, and the numbers are chilling. What the numbers were showing is that at least 49% of CSO surveyed said that their financial income has reduced considerably, but they can continue working. But then almost, again, another 40% said their financial situation has gotten seriously worse and that they cannot continue their work or will soon have to stop. So when you look at totality, it was about 89 of CSO respondents saying that the pandemic negatively impacted their financial situation. So in other words, the funding of CSOs is a critical issue. And I'm so excited to have a very distinguished panel to have this conversation about what to do about this. So let me very quickly introduce the panelists that we have today. Some friends I know, some who I am meeting for the first time, very excited to meet them for the first time. And I will start with who I see on my screen right away. And I see Jeff. I think, can you all see Jeff Thindwa? Jeff, can you unmute yourself and wave so people can know who I'm introducing? There is Jeff.
Yes.
Huh?
Yes.
Wonderful. Welcome, Jeff. So Jeff is currently the program manager for the Global Partnership for Social Accountability in the Governance Global Practice at the World Bank. During his 20 years at the World Bank, he's held numerous positions in the field of social accountability, governance, and his experience includes government, private sector, and civil society. So really lovely to have you, Jeff. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
Then I see next on the screen, David Sasaki. And I'm really wondering what time of the day it is for David. David, welcome. What time of the day is it for you? Is it early morning?
It's 7:45 here in California. So I just had my first cup of coffee. It's kicking in. Hopefully I'll be fully awake.
So welcome, David. And thank you for getting up so early, bright and early on this call. So for participants, David is a program officer in the Global Development and Population at the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. He supports organizations and activities that seek to improve the provision of public services through transparency, participation, and accountability mechanisms. Before working with Hewlett, David worked with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, where he managed a portfolio of grants to media organizations. And David holds a bachelor's degree in Third World Studies and Political Science from the University of California, San Diego. So David, warm welcome on this bright, sunny California morning. Eh?
Thanks, Taka. Pleasure to be here.
Yes. So then I would like to introduce my friend, Rose. Rose, please unmute. Let's see you and wave so people can see you there.
Hi.
Hi, Rose. And I know at least Rose is on my time zone. She's right here in West Africa with us. So Rose is the co-founder of Epic Africa, where she fulfills her mission to fill critical data and capacity gaps in the philanthropic marketplace on the continent. Rose has over 25 years of experience in grant making and strategy development to boost organizational effectiveness across Africa. Rose holds a master's degree in development planning and management from the African Institute of Economic and Development Planning. So Rose, you're very welcome. And then last, but not least, is my other friend, Dr. Ibrahima. Hello there.
Hi, Becca. It's been a long while.
Doc, yes, lovely to see you again. I think the last time I might have seen you, was it an airport or was it here? Anyway, Omalara knows these are always reunions, these webinars of old friends. So Dr. Ibrahima Aidara is the Deputy Executive Director of OSIWA. He's an astute economist and has over 2 decades of experience in economic and trade policy making, regional governance, advisory for extractive industries, industrial and development, international development, and civil society across Africa. Ibrahima holds a master's degree and a PhD in economics from the University Sheikh Anta Diop in Dakar, Senegal. So lovely to have you, Ibrahima.
Thank you very much, Doctor.
So participants, this is the distinguished panel we have in front of us. And what we propose to do, I'm going to jump right into it because we don't have too much time and we really want to hear everything we can get from our panelists. We will have the discussion in 2 parts. So the first part of the conversation is we'll really be hearing from the panelists on, what is the current situation? What has changed in terms of their priorities, what they're currently funding with respect to CSOs? What has changed in terms of their funding modalities with civil society? And finally, it would also be interesting to hear from them, what are some of the current constraints you are facing that it's important for some of your civil society partners and otherwise to fully understand? So let's just start with a quick 10 minutes going around in terms of what is changing in terms of priorities, modalities, and some of the current constraints that you're facing. The second part of the conversation later, we'll talk about sustainability, innovative models. So who can I start with? David, has your coffee kicked in yet, David? Can we start with you?
I think it's there. At least half of the cup, yes.
Okay,
sure.
So quick 10 minutes on Hewlett Foundation. What's changed, priorities, modalities, any constraints you're facing?
Yeah, what a year. I can't believe we're about to enter October. It's gone by quickly. I think at Hewlett Foundation, we stopped going into the office in late March, and we've all been working at home ever since. Most of my days are basically what I'm doing right now on Zoom calls from about 7 o'clock in the morning until 4 o'clock in the evening. And when, I would say in April, when we were really, I think, getting to an appropriate understanding of the impact of COVID and realizing that this was not a matter of just a couple of months, but we were talking about a year or more. Then at the same time, the stock market in the United States took a serious dive, which affects our endowment. So we are a private grant making foundation. We have about $10 billion in assets. And every year we disperse around 5% of that in grant making. I work on the global development program. And so we typically fund between $100 and $120 million per year. All of a sudden we were faced with the prospect that we were going to have to cut about 10% of our expected grant making for this year and then plan on an expected 10% of the cut for next year. So the first thing that we did was write a blog post explaining how we prepare for financial market reduction. And then we got on calls with grantees, especially to understand what their needs were from those that were reliant on government funding. Because the grantee organizations that rely more on bilateral funding, that rely on government earned income from contracts, we saw they were the ones who were the most affected by the economic fallout. Governments just did not have money to spend on civil society as they did in the past. So after we had a plan about how we were going to make reductions, then the stock market came roaring back. And in fact, it's gone up and down a little bit in the past month, but we ended up not having to make any cuts at all. So this was a bit of a whiplash for us in preparing how we would prioritize grant making and also try to be responsive to COVID with a stock market that dictates how much we're able to fund, and then realizing actually we can do the same level of funding as before. So as we're doing that type of financial planning, we're also asking ourselves two types of questions. One, is there anything about what we fund strategically that we should do differently? In the context of COVID, are there new priorities that we should be thinking about or new opportunities where we should be investing more money? So we thought about the idea of all of us reducing our planned grant making by about 10% and using that money for a special COVID response fund. And what we found in discussions with grantee organizations is that the work that they were already doing on procurement monitoring, budget monitoring for some of these stimulus packages that were coming out, debt monitoring for increased debt, or negotiations with mining companies and extractives companies, some advocacy work that we fund around equitable access to healthcare, all of those things were more, not less relevant during the context of COVID. Across the board, as we looked at all of the organizations that we fund and the strategic outcomes we fund, there was nothing that made sense for us to cut back on at all. So we realized we shouldn't change what we're funding, but then we asked ourselves, should we change how we're funding? And soon after COVID, in late March, we and 40 other funders, mostly US-based private foundations, signed a pledge saying our bias, our default is going to be for total flexibility in all funding. If you are a grantee organization, if you receive funding from the Hewlett Foundation, and that funding is earmarked for certain projects, certain budgets, certain salaries, and now in order to respond to the current crisis, you need to change your budgets, you need more flexibility, then our default position is going to say, yes, you can use that money however you'd like to use it. And there are some tax limitations on this. If it's a for-profit company based in another country, there are limitations on what US tax law says that we're able to do. But even there, we tried to maximize flexibility as much as possible. And several other donors came on and signed that pledge as well. What I'm hopeful of is that this is a learning experience for us as funders, that what I've heard termed the tyranny of conditionality, all of these conditions that we put on our funding, all of these reporting requirements, maybe they're not actually as necessary as we thought they were. In the same way that we're asking ourselves, do I really need to be traveling to countries every single month? Can't we have quite a few of these conversations over Zoom calls? Wouldn't that be better for the planet? I think we're also seeing that we can have a much more trust-based model of philanthropy, of funding. We can have longer funding horizons. We can have more flexible funding. One implication for that I'd like to put on the table for discussion is that if we give longer term, more flexible funding to current grantee partners, then that does limit the amount of funding that we have to make new grants to new organizations. And so I do worry that this could lead to an entrenchment where program officer staff at foundations keep giving money to the same organizations. There's almost like a monopoly of civil society power in some countries, and we don't invest enough in the regeneration of new leadership, in new models, in new innovation. So that's one concern that I have. I guess the only other thing that I would add is, I should say, first off, that I am very much not an expert or well-informed about West Africa in the context, West African politics at all. I'm filling in for my colleague, Pat Scheid here, who has a family emergency. Most of my funding is in East Africa and Mexico. But it's really humbling to be based in the United States right now, where I work on governance issues. And so often we come at this with a real arrogant perspective of we have the answers and let's help the governance of other places. And this year has shown, if only we had the type of leadership and response that I've read about in Senegal and Ghana and how we've responded to COVID. And so we're called the Global Development Program. And I think we need to start actually thinking about what global development means. It's not exporting models to other countries. It's not teaching other people how to have democracies, or it's helping each other. It's learning from one another. And I can sure see right now that in this country, we have a lot to learn from others as well.
Brilliant. Oh, thank you so much, David. Very thoughtful reflections, and I think some further questions for us to ponder and discuss. So participants, I'm going to jump to the next panelist. So if you have questions, comments, please put them in the chat. When we're done with all the panelists, we'll come to your questions. So I would like to move next to you, Ibrahima. Share with us how Osiwa has responded. Change in priorities, modalities, any implications, constraints you're facing. Over to you, Ibrahima. Don't forget to unmute yourself. You're still muted. You know, that's the saying of 2020. You're on mute. Go ahead.
Thank you, Taka. I'll be speaking in French.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, merci beaucoup, Taka. Et encore une fois, félicitations à Waxi. Du point de vue de Osiwa, ce que nous avons fait depuis le mois de mars, quand nous avons commencé le télétravail, nous avions pensé à mettre en place une stratégie de réponse à la pandémie. Et donc, nous avions justement articulé donc cette stratégie autour de deux plans. Le premier plan, était un plan d'urgence où nous avions convoqué l'expérience que nous avions acquise pendant la pandémie récente de Ebola, que nous avions convoqué, et nous avions aussi consulté les partenaires dans les différents pays où nous intervenons pour voir quelles sont les nouvelles priorités, les nouveaux défis qui se présentent pour faire face à l'urgence de la COVID. Et donc, nous avions articulé donc cette stratégie de réponse d'urgence autour de 4 objectifs stratégiques. Le premier, c'était comment est-ce que nous pouvons générer des analyses et des recherches contextualisées qui soient spécifiques au contexte ouest-africain, qu'on ne reçoit pas seulement, comme David disait, les informations, les études du reste du monde qui viennent informer nos interventions et nos politiques. Nous voulons générer localement cette connaissance-là pour informer notre politique de façon contextuelle. Et le deuxième objectif, c'était comment soutenir le service public de la santé avec les travailleurs de la santé. Et le troisième, le plus important, c'est comment est-ce qu'on peut, disons, soutenir la fourniture d'informations aux citoyens et finalement soutenir donc les organisations de la société civile. Donc, quand nous avions articulé donc cette stratégie de réponse à côté de notre stratégie traditionnelle que nous avions mise en place depuis maintenant 4 ans, nous nous sommes rendus compte qu'il y a des activités traditionnelles qu'on ne peut pas continuer à mener à cause de la pandémie, à cause des mesures qui ont été mises en place par les pouvoirs publics. Donc, le premier changement qui avait été opéré, c'est au niveau des partenaires eux-mêmes. Donc, nous avions demandé à tous nos partenaires de voir comment est-ce qu'ils pouvaient adapter leur programme, leur budget et pour prendre en compte le nouveau contexte. Et donc, la plupart des partenaires ont fait cette expression de demande pour ajuster leur budget en fonction du contexte et leur permettre de continuer à opérer, mais à être toujours relevant, à être toujours pertinent au contexte, en répondant de façon significative au contexte et pas de façon traditionnelle comparé à ce qu'ils faisaient avant. Donc, il y a ce shift, ce changement de budget interne aux partenaires eux-mêmes qui a été autorisé. Donc, une certaine flexibilité a été donc instaurée à ce niveau-là. La deuxième flexibilité que nous avons nous-mêmes opérée, c'est au niveau de notre propre budget, au niveau de OSIWA, où nous avions regardé quelles sont, dans nos activités traditionnelles, quelles sont les activités que nous ne pouvons pas mener cette année à cause de cette pandémie-là et des restrictions qui ont été mises en place dans les différents pays. Et donc, nous avons fait effectivement une certaine coupure dans le budget traditionnel de nos activités traditionnelles pour, disons, le redéployer dans les 4 objectifs stratégiques que j'ai énumérés dans la stratégie de réponse. Et donc, nous avions plus ou moins coupé plus d'1 million, 1 million 100 de notre budget classique et le réaffecter, mais avec les mêmes partenaires avec qui nous travaillons donc sur les mêmes questions. Parce qu'au total, ce qui s'est passé, les mêmes défis, les défis sur lesquels nous travaillons que Taka avait mentionné dans son introduction, les défis de gouvernance politique, les défis de gouvernance judiciaire ou de gouvernance sont toujours là et sont même beaucoup plus amplifiés par l'impact du Covid. Donc, ce n'est pas des défis nouveaux sur lesquels nous adressons. Donc, c'était facile de faire ce shift et maintenir le niveau de financement que nous apportons aux organisations de la société civile. Donc, nous avions fait ceci et nous sommes allés au niveau donc, du réseau global pour demander du financement supplémentaire que nous avons reçu à hauteur de 3 500 000 pour soutenir donc, ces activités-là. Par la suite, nous avions réalisé que cette crise-là n'est pas une crise conjoncturelle. Ce n'est pas une crise qui va durer 6 mois ou 1 an est passé. Même si aujourd'hui, les nouvelles infections sont arrêtées, l'impact va probablement, disons, s'étendre sur plusieurs mois ou encore, en tout cas, sur l'année prochaine. Donc, il fallait mettre en place une stratégie, disons, qui va compléter la réponse, mais aussi une stratégie à moyen et long terme qui va donc adresser les questions beaucoup plus structurelles. Donc, et cette stratégie-là également était articulée autour de 2 principaux domaines, notamment les questions de gouvernance politique. Nous nous sommes rendus compte que les questions sur lesquelles nous travaillons ont été négativement impactées par le Covid, notamment les questions de gouvernance démocratique, de respect de la Constitution, les droits humains, donc l'état de droit, mais aussi les questions de restructuration économique. Étant entendu que l'économie, pour une longue période, surtout en Afrique de l'Ouest, où nous avons connu une longue période de croissance, va entrer pour la première fois en récession. Donc, comment est-ce qu'il faut faire la reconstruction et la reconstruction économique sans éviter, disons, l'erreur de reproduire les mêmes vulnérabilités et les mêmes fragilités au choc. Reconstruire une économie, mais qui soit beaucoup plus résiliente et durable. Donc, nous avions donc articulé donc, cette nouvelle stratégie à moyen et long terme, où nous avons encore sollicité les fonds de réserve au niveau donc, du siège. Et nous avions aussi effectivement reçu ces fonds-là à hauteur au total 3 500 000 pour continuer à soutenir donc, nos partenaires dans la région. Au total, si nous avions coupé dans un premier temps, au début de la crise, notre budget classique qui adressait donc notre stratégie traditionnelle, nous avions reçu plus de fonds et nous avions été encore plus flexibles pour permettre aux partenaires de continuer à travailler et à être résilients par rapport aux effets de la pandémie. Donc, je vais m'arrêter là pour l'instant.
Great. Thank you so much, Ibrahima. Again, really interesting reflections. And it's so interesting how I'm seeing that at least with these first two organizations or foundations, we actually have seen increased funding, more flexibility, and already starting to think what you do differently going forward, whether it's about more flexibility going forward, or even in Osiwa's case, ensuring that you're dealing with issues around political governance or creating more inclusive economies that deal with these structural issues that made certain groups so much more vulnerable to things like the pandemic and shock. So really interesting. Okay. So Jeff, you know I'm coming to you. Jeff and I just realized that actually we had met. Jeff, if it was 2007, that's 13 years ago. You see how small the world is? Me, I'm looking younger. I hope that's why you didn't recognize me right away, right? You're on mute, Jeff. Lovely to see you again.
That is the reason, you know, and because I've grown bald and I've got gray hair and gray beard, you can't recognize me.
Don't worry, on this continent, those are symbols of wisdom. So we're anxious to hear your wisdom.
well said. Yeah, there you are. There you are. Yeah, so thank you. I'm sorry I missed Ibrahima's statement or presentation because I the instructions for interpretation I caught that late. So, but I hope I can make up for it somehow. And David, good to see you. It's been a long while. And greetings everyone. I'm Jeff, and I manage the Global Partnership for Social Accountability, GPSA, here in the World Bank. And just a quick note there, our mission is really to expand opportunity for civil society to work with, to collaborate with governments to solve critical development challenges. And we make grants to CSOs. Our model, we refer to it as collaborative social accountability. And it combines both the notion of holding government to account, but with the eye on the prize, which is what problem are we trying to solve? And if you're going to be solving problems collaboratively, how does that work? And so we've had 7 years to demonstrate how that would work, because it also carries all of the attending risks of CSO government collaboration, just in terms of co-optation and so on. We're situated in the World Bank's social sustainability and inclusion global practice. And one advantage we have is that the GPSA works with the World Bank country and sector teams, and we actually help to link CSO partners to governments to broker that relationship and to ensure that the practices and lessons from our social accountability programs can get institutionalized and scaled up through government. So let me just very quickly talk about the funding issue. So I'm wearing two caps here. There's the GPSA cap, which, as I said, is really about making grants to civil society organizations. And I'm wearing the kind of World Bank cap as well. So the harshness of COVID-19 to the global economy, we're all familiar with that. So the projection of the economy shrinking by 5.2% this year. By World Bank accounts, the deepest recession since the Second World War. Major implications for poverty reduction, and it threatens to push between 71 and 100 million people into extreme poverty worldwide. I think Taka, you alluded to this at the beginning. It exposes systemic policy flaws, and it exposes social and economic inequality. It heightens the risks faced by the poorest populations, who are often least able to afford adequate health care. So the World Bank is providing up to $160 billion over 15 years. And this includes $50 billion in IDA resources on grant and highly concessional terms. A lot of you will be familiar with the IDA program. and the coverage is over 100 developing countries, home to 70% of the world's population. So it's quite an expansive outreach and support program. The resources will enable countries to implement emergency health operations, social protection, which includes cash transfers for households, saving jobs and businesses, and really getting assistance and including money to those who need it the most. An important feature which is often not mentioned is this advocacy for debt relief, where we've collaborated with the IMF and the G20 and successfully suspended countries' debt services to bilateral creditors. And that's an opportunity there also for IDA countries to enhance transparency of their public financial commitments. Just in terms of then so CSOs have maintained interest in what the World Bank is doing. We have regular interactions with a group of CSOs every month. We have also an expert advisory council on citizen engagement, and some of the messages that we're picking up very strongly are the importance of creating space for these large financial provisions of multilaterals and bilaterals to create this space where CSOs can track these resources and indeed monitor how they're being implemented. And that's an ongoing conversation. It's going to be ultimately dependent on the nature of the program. It's going to depend on the accessibility of countries and the work of individual task teams within the bank. But there's an example that I've been working on. In fact, I was up early today on a conference call with a donor who has provided resources to enable the GPSA to do a competitive call in a Central Asian country. And because it's an ongoing conversation, I prefer not to mention the country because there are delicate discussions going on even with government. But the focus is third-party monitoring of a new World Bank operation that is helping the country address its huge and growing COVID challenge. And it's focused on health systems and cash transfer programs to households and so on. And the third-party monitoring will be conducted by the successful civil society organizations. And already we've agreed to support it with a system of rules and a framework of cooperation with CSO monitoring across 5 countries. So the donor who is supporting this is also supporting COVID monitoring in 5 countries. We think that one of the things to come out of this is potentially just to learn how CSOs are conducting participatory monitoring of COVID financing and participatory monitoring of COVID programs, the government's COVID programs. We know that CSOs are also involved in their own right in community engagement and indeed in last mile service delivery in response to the pandemic. On the GPSA front, what we did was to conduct a survey of over 300 GPSA partners that are engaged in the COVID-19, including core implementing partners. Sometimes they're called grantees. I've grown to not like that word, the implementing partners, using key informant interviews to understand how COVID-19 has affected them and what their response has been. And what we've observed is that how so many of them have adjusted their traditional programming in order to support processes of targeting communities, in order to focus on monitoring public financing. And an important kind of common theme across most of their work is this work to mediate information flows, counter disinformation, and indeed to monitor so that they can enable government responsiveness to be open and transparent and to support so-called last mile delivery of services. This is significant because it speaks to real possibilities of adaptation in order to focus on the elephant in the room, which is big money coming for COVID. And I'll put that kind of as a question. I think it was David who put a question on the table, which is how to safeguard the regular programming that potentially could be given less priority because of the COVID response, and how do CSOs juggle and manage that tension between safeguarding ongoing work and being totally responsive to the new emerging and compelling need of COVID. So what we see, for example, in Brazil, CSOs tracking food that's available and water within the communities, mobilizing and mapping actions that are related to COVID-19 in the favelas, but also adapting the information, interpreting the information, and ensuring that it speaks to people's realities. We work with a partner in DR Congo who is using, that's the CODAID, using health development committees, for example, which have been a part of the grant that they have implemented over 40 years. And so they have a strong kind of social capital in that space, and using that to distribute kits to vulnerable populations near health clinics, and prioritizing and solving medical supply shortages and so on. What our task is at the GPSA is to, since we don't have kind of big new grants that we will be giving to the CSOs, we have two proposals that are in the making, almost completed. One is a proposal to invite partners who can support adaptive and alternative complementary community engagement approaches using innovations, especially ICT innovations, so that what constraints they're experiencing in the COVID response imposed by COVID safety measures, such as social distancing and the curtailment of travel and human interface, how can we support them? A lot of CSOs, a lot of you on the call are already doing this, but we think that we can really raise the game and get resources to CSOs to enable them to continue the work of social accountability and participatory monitoring of public resources and public programs. So that's just one proposal that's more inclined to adaptation and technology. Another one is just looking about the health dimension of this. How can we leverage the experiences that we've had supporting collaborative social accountability to improve health systems? How can we adapt and transfer that to enable and empower CSOs through grants to support and strengthen the health response and health systems in the context of COVID? So all of this to say that we are cognizant of the kind of challenges that the CSOs we surveyed are going through, and we are impressed with how they are managing to pivot to the COVID response whilst being responsible for ongoing grants. What we have done with respect to ongoing grants, and GPSA grants run between 3 and 5 years, is to get the information about what exactly is the constraint. How is COVID affecting the sequencing of your programs, of your activities, and your capacity to continue to support community engagement, and then to provide those flexibilities and just enable them to not feel the pressure to continue irrespective, but to adapt in how they implement their programs. I can see I'm running out of time. Let me stop.
Yes, yes. No, but it's been brilliant. Thank you so much, Jeff. So much to cover, so many interesting conversations. And again, I'm seeing some common themes. I think one of the things you really emphasize that's striking me that the other foundations, Hewlett and Osiwa, had done, but the bank, your team in the bank have also done, is consulted, engaged, listened to civil society in terms of how are you pivoting, how are you adjusting, what is it you need to do differently. So I think that's another dimension we need to recognize. So thank you for that, Jeff. And now we'll come to Rose. And Rose, you've been, I think, positioned really well at the end of this conversation, because in many respects, you are the one who has this broad overview. You may not be giving out grants directly, but you're gathering the data, you're doing the research, you have your fingers on the pulse in terms of what's happening with respect to civil society. So Rose, tell us, what are you seeing in terms of the funding? What's changed, the modalities? What are you hearing from within civil society? Over to you, Rose.
Thank you, Taka, and thank you, everybody. I'm really happy to be here and to be sharing what I know and what we're observing. Now, the speakers before me, they all came from funding institutions, as you've mentioned, Taka. I'm not from that world, although I've been there before. I work in the space between philanthropy and civil society. Specifically, EPIC Africa we're among kind of emerging group of African-led and Africa-based philanthropy infrastructure organizations. And what we're doing is, trying to fill some of the critical gaps, especially in data on African CSOs, with the hope that, we can bring greater attention and visibility to the work that they do. We are also hoping that by so doing, we'll help to strengthen the capacity of African groups and push them to really claim their rightful place at policy tables on this continent and elsewhere, where decisions affecting the well-being of the continent are being made. As we've all seen with COVID, governments have completely failed to recognize and utilize, local CSO skills, experience, and networks in response to COVID. And this oversight, as we all know, has, weakened the planning, the coordination, and the implementation of national responses, as well as, of course, the ability of CSOs to expand and sustain their impact. Now, for us, from where we sit, we see that COVID, what has created many new and urgent financial problems for the sector, but what it has really done, I think, is to accelerate the impact of, the starvation cycle and really intensify many of the pre-existing financial fragility that we know has long characterized the sector. So let me just start by sharing maybe some findings from a recent survey that EPIC Africa, in partnership with African NGOs, conducted about 2 months into the crisis, which included just over 1,000 groups from 44 countries. I'll share the report if you haven't seen it. Please read it. I think you'll find it interesting. So around, just to kind of paint the financial fragility picture of the space, we found that 50% of the respondents had actually just an average annual budget of under $100,000. Only 5% had an annual budget of over $2 million. And only 34% reported having any reserves. At the time of our survey, which was conducted end of April into like mid-May, 56% of respondents had already experienced a loss of funding, and 66% expected that this loss of funding would continue into the next 3 to 6 months. Of course, at that time we were thinking, like most people, that COVID was going to be, with us for a few months and then we'll be back to normal. So our outlook and their outlook was, next 3 to 6 months. At the same time, many of them, particularly those that provide services, were also seeing an increase in demand for their services and a rising cost, of course, to do with having to change the way they work. Working from home came with cost. There was some savings, but it also came with certain other costs. Now, in addition to this, almost 50% reported that some of their funders had informed them that COVID-19 might impact their ability to continue support. In fact, 77% of the respondents all said that they thought that the COVID-19 would have a really devastating impact on the sustainability of many CSOs. And I think those findings are really being corroborated by the report that Taka, you cited in your introductory remarks from Civicas, which was done, I think, probably a month after ours. Now, so if we can unpack those numbers and what they mean, you know, for me, one of the things that's really clear is that when you talk of civil society, African civil society organizations, I mean, they come in all sorts of formations in terms of size, typology, where they work. Are they working at the national level? Are they working at the community level? We were not able to disaggregate to that level, which would be really interesting, and we hope to do that in a follow-up survey to see are there sectors of or subsectors of CSOs that are doing worse than others. We know that there's some that have not, a few that have not had any negative impact, but we expect that depending on the type of work that a group does, where it's located, may have an impact. And I think that's important because then it can help to inform some of the solutions that hopefully we'll discuss later and how those get rolled out. Now, this of course sounds like a really grim picture, and it is rather grim. But we also saw that through this survey that CSOs were actually demonstrating incredible resilience and adaptability and creativity, and were pivoting to do things like working from home, but also to engage in activities in response to COVID-19. Now, we also saw that inside, many of them reported, I think about 50% reported that they had witnessed, more engagement by their boards in their work, as well as we saw that some of them were having to introduce cost-cutting measures. We also heard from them that they had introduced new program activities, and this was really interesting to respond directly to COVID-19, despite for many of them not having any new money. And 78% of the respondents indicated that these activities were actually in line with their mission. And I think that's interesting, that they did not see this as mission creep. They saw the work that they do on a day-to-day basis as actually speaking to the concerns around COVID, the non-medical concerns around COVID. Now, most striking for us was actually looking at the funding sources for the new COVID-related activities. And we were surprised to find that the leading source of the new funding was actually from local individual donors, with about 41% of the CSO surveyed saying that this was the leading source of the new funding for them, followed by the local private sector, followed by international foundations, then international NGOs, then local foundations in 5th place. Bilaterals and multilateral agencies were in 6th place at 12%. And finally, government at about 11% of the respondents said that they had gotten funding from government. They also reported kind of new ways of or perhaps intensified partnerships and collaboration. 83% of the respondents reported that they were collaborating with other CSOs in their own countries in support of a range of issues, but mainly around sharing information, providing services to people in need. Very few of them were kind of doing joint fundraising. It's only about 12% that had actually come together to do some kind of joint fundraising or to advocate for the sector and for support from government. And now I was going to go perhaps to try a little bit, but maybe I'm getting ahead of myself. So I think I'll stop there. I'm sure there will be many questions. Yeah. So let me stop there.
Oh, brilliant, brilliant, brilliant. Thank you, Rose. So useful to get that dimension and maybe a more rounded sense of the reality that CSOs are facing out there. Okay, so we're about to come to the time where our participants can ask questions. Either you can put them in the chat. I've already seen a question from Bolu Tife, or you can raise your hand. Omolara will signal to me if you see somebody's hand is raised. Participants, I think you know where to raise your hand on just do that blue raising hand thing, and then we'll see you out there. Huh? But maybe, and this will be open to any of the panelists, as you can see in the chat. And I haven't forgotten the other two questions, one that David raised and the second one that Jeff, you raised. In our second round, when we start to think, what are the models going forward? We can come back to those really critical questions you asked. But Bolu Tife is asking, how can we leverage the aggregate experience of COVID responses to reconstruct some of our policy formulation and implementation? So how can we really draw on that learning we're getting from this period to influence how we do I'm assuming she's meaning government policy formulation and implementation. Okay. Any other questions? Am I seeing any other hands raised? Omolara, do you see any hands raised?
Not at this moment, not at this moment. So I think we can just take that one.
Okay.
I won't be surprised if colleagues are trying to locate where to raise their hands.
you can also, you can do the old-fashioned way and show your video and start waving like this. Then we will try and see you. Okay, so who would like to take that one?
Okay, we have a hand also.
Okay. Maybe we'll see whose hand was up. Let me see if I see.
We have Lois' hand up. Lois Uta.
All right, yeah. Let's have Lois go right ahead. Why don't you unmute yourself? We'll hear your question, and then that way our panelists can take both. Go ahead.
Yes, I have done that. Good evening from Nigeria.
Good evening.
Yeah, my name is Lois Auta. I'm the founder of Cedar Seed Foundation. Cedar Seed Foundation is an organization that advocates and promotes disability rights. And so far, we have reached out to almost 4,000 persons with disabilities with palliatives during this COVID-19. So I want to know, what are your plans in terms of healthcare facilities, access to economic empowerment for persons with disabilities, because they are the most hardest hit. They are the most excluded, discriminated, and underrepresented when it comes to opportunities. So I want to know your plans for this category of people. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lois. So question on how you're responding to the exclusion and limitations faced by people with disabilities in terms of lack of opportunities.
Yeah, huh?
Thank you, Lois. We can mute you now. Then you see Emmanuel has a question. Do you think the pandemic has shifted CSO resource mobilization efforts towards domestic resources as alternatives? And I think this is coming out from Rose's presentation. What are the implications of this for CSO sustainability? So as we start to see the growth of local philanthropy, what are the implications of this for CSO sustainability? Great, so we have 3 questions on the floor. Let's pause here and open it up. Omolara, is that okay? We go back to the panelists?
Yes, please, we can.
Okay. So who would like to take that? Jeff, Ibrahima, Rose, or David?
Je vais essayer d'adresser les 2 premières questions, donner ma perspective. Je pense que la première question sur la modélisation, elle est très importante pour que nous-mêmes, en tant qu'Africains, avec la récurrence des pandémies que nous avons sur le continent, dans notre région en Afrique de l'Ouest, récemment Ebola, maintenant c'est cette pandémie-là, mettre ensemble cette expérience-là, modéliser et pour servir de leçon pour le futur et influencer nos propres politiques. Parce que il ne sert à rien, premièrement, il ne sert à rien d'inventer la roue, alors qu'on a un nombre, disons, intéressant d'expériences qu'il y a dans la région. Deuxièmement, il ne sert à rien d'importer des modèles d'ailleurs et que nous devons nous-mêmes nous appuyer sur notre propre expérience et développer nos propres politiques. Donc, éviter d'importer des modèles de l'extérieur avec des politiques de l'extérieur qui, de toute façon, ne vont pas servir. Ce qui fait que nous, par exemple, au niveau de OSIWA, comme je l'ai indiqué, nous appuyons des organisations qui collectent les informations pour développer nos propres modèles, mais aussi influencer la politique sectorielle de la santé pour que ça ne soit pas non seulement caporalisé par les techniciens de la santé seulement, mais aussi que ça ne soit pas importé de chez mon collègue Jeff et d'ailleurs pour, disons, avoir une politique locale contextualisée, n'est-ce pas, et qui puisse répondre à nos besoins. Je pense que ça, c'est vraiment fondamental et nous devons non seulement la modélisation pour l'influence, mais aussi pour la recherche. Par exemple, nos laboratoires domestiques doivent être renforcés pour produire la connaissance, produire les médicaments pour nous-mêmes, par nous-mêmes. Et donc, ça, c'est très important. La deuxième question sur l'inclusion, je pense que ça aussi, c'est vraiment fondamental parce que nous avons vu que les stratégies n'ont pas forcément tenu en compte cet aspect-là, surtout les personnes vivant avec les handicaps. Par exemple, toutes ces questions qu'on a vécues sur le lockdown, etc. Il y avait les distance learning qu'on avait mis en œuvre dans certaines écoles. Par exemple, les personnes vivant avec les handicaps étaient exclues de ces gens-là. Qu'en est-il, par exemple, des personnes qui ne voient pas ou pour accéder à Internet, pour accéder aux choses? Donc, nous avions, disons, nous avons engagé un plaidoyer au niveau de OSIWA pour, disons, prendre en compte ces catégories considérées comme vulnérables. Par exemple, nous avons soutenu un partenaire au Ghana sur la question de l'éducation. Comment est-ce qu'on peut faciliter l'éducation à distance avec des personnes qui ont des vues faibles ou qui ne voient pas, par exemple. Des choses comme ça, et engager ces plaidoyers-là au niveau des politiques publiques pour que les politiques de réponse puissent prendre en compte donc, ces catégories-là vulnérables et qui ne sont pas nécessairement prises en compte dans les réponses. Les réponses qu'on a vues avec les plans, ces minorités-là ou ces catégories vulnérables ne sont pas nécessairement inclus là-dedans. Donc, je pense que c'est une question très importante. Je vais m'arrêter là et laisser les collègues d'ajouter leurs perspectives et sur la troisième réponse, sur la troisième question.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ibrahima, for that very comprehensive response to the first two, the second one on inclusion and the first one on learning to influence our policy formulation and implementation. Thank you. Rose, I hear you've unmuted yourself. Would you like to chime in?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to take that last question. Do you think the COVID-19 pandemic has shifted CSO's resource mobilization efforts towards domestic resource alternatives? And what are the implications of this for CSO's stability? Now, the whole question of domestic resource mobilization is one that has been gaining momentum pre-COVID. I have attended a couple of webinars. I think one was actually organized by Waxy on this very question. So it's very much on people's mind. What we haven't seen is any real sort of movement to then ask, how do you do this? And to start to come up with, practical strategies of actually, how do you do domestic resource mobilization, or even begin to understand what that terrain looks like. Where's the money, and how do you get it? So we know it's a good thing. We know it's good to diversify, but there are very few models of actually how you do it. Very few examples of groups that are actually doing it, successfully. Another point to note is that whenever there's an emergency, people are quick to give, and we have seen. I remember several years ago, there was a terrible flood in northern Kenya. Taka is nodding, I think she remembers that. And the Red Cross set a target, do some fundraising and set a target, and I think they exceeded the target like in the first day, and went on to exceed it by multiples of, tens. People gave. So we have seen this particularly in emergencies. Now, the challenge and the question that we haven't examined or seen how that would go is, are we Africans willing to fund organizations or issues that are of a more systemic nature, where it's hard to take pictures of a policy change, We still are sort of in a place where we like the brick and mortar, I can see, yeah, that money went and bought blankets, it bought food, we've given food, and but this more strategic, if you will. I mean, we must do that, of course. The emergency, we've got to help people. But the more sort of strategic, long-term kind of issues, that is something that we need to explore and understand and test whether it can actually happen. And how do you pitch that? I think it should not be too difficult, but now what does it mean, implication for CSO sustainability? I think for me, CSO sustainability will lie on being funded domestically. It's not to say that you're going to stop needing funding from foreign sources, but I think really the long-term sustainability, and I think maybe we need to unpack what sustainability means. Is it just more dollars, multi-billion dollars, or is it the kind of money? Is it the kind of work that's being funded? What do we mean? And really examine what is it that holds Africans themselves from funding their own organization, whether it's businesses or individuals, issues of legitimacy and credibility, issues of visibility. I mean, most Africans, you ask them about CSOs and they have no idea, oh, what do they do? So I think there's a lot of work to be done in terms of visibility, in terms of telling our story. What do we really do? What does this sector do? And not think that just by doing good works will be noticed and people will want to fund us. Yeah. So there's work to be done. I guess that's my takeaway.
Really useful, really useful. Thank you, Rose. And I see there have been further questions in the chat. There's been a question there by Luis Champong, but in some respects, we're very nicely coming to the second part of the conversation, which is really about this issue around sustainability. And I don't want to forget the earlier questions that David and Jeff raised. So maybe as we come back around to the panelists and we start to think about innovative models, frameworks to strengthen CSO sustainability, but also to deal with these intractable challenges you raised, some ideas. So I'm going to start with you, David. And David, I'm going to be really naughty. When people raise a question, it's usually because they are already starting to think of some answers. So I'm actually going to bring you back to that fantastic question you raised, because I think what's emerging is when we hear what Hewlett has been doing, when we hear what Osiwa has been doing, when we hear about what the bank has been doing, we are hearing about increased levels of resources and indeed more flexibility to CSOs. Yet on the other hand, we're also hearing from Rose that a significant number of organizations are actually pivoting and dancing on a very small budget. So your concern is real. who are these larger amounts going to? As your foundations and organizations commit to even further funding, how do we ensure that we're actually not perpetuating the very same inequalities we see in civil society that we are trying to avoid? And I think this was your ultimate question. So it would be interesting to hear some of your thoughts around this and what funding models you are thinking of using, what approaches to both strengthen civil society, but also to make sure that the space is a lot more inclusive of all forms of organizations. That was a very long question, but over to you, David.
It's such a great question and so eloquent. I wish I could match your eloquence in my answer, but I'm struggling a little bit. You know, in thinking that through, I also do want to respond to Luis's question about donors' tendency, especially in the past, but I think it continues, to support projects and not organizations. And this is a point that I know that Rose has brought up and brings up continually, that especially for African civil society organizations, international donors fund these one-off projects where they'll say, oh, you know, 10% of overhead so you can invest in your communications or what you need to invest in. That does not permit an organization to then recruit really talented staff, which is necessary, mentor the next generation of leadership, and do the type of narrative work that Rose was just alluding to show the importance of civil society organizations in a country's evolution, and beyond just kind of the responding to the flood or feeding hungry children, but some of the systemic work that happens in governance and policy work. So how we approach this is that we have a bias toward flexible funding. And in addition to providing core operating support, we also have another grant-making instrument called organizational effectiveness grants, because we find that even when we allow an organization or encourage an organization to have flexible funding, they still want to dedicate the majority of those resources to programmatic work, because that's what they care about the most. And it's, you know, I think that we have learned for some reason to feel like it's selfish to invest in the organization, to invest in the people. And we need to really get out of that mindset. If we want to be resilient, you know, Taka, in your words at the beginning, you said the importance of civil society is to confront the inequality and the rising inequality that we're all seeing in all of our countries. And I think that's right. I think also a major role of civil society is to address the historical inequities and oppression and discrimination that has been rampant in all of our societies. That is not work that's done over a one-year project or a two-year project, right? That's going to take the next 50 years. So how do we build institutions that are resilient and sustainable, and also that renew and don't get stuck and remain innovative in the type of way that Jeff was talking about, using new technologies and new approaches. So I do have one hopefully practical suggestion as to how that can be done. And that is to build organizations' funding reserves. So a paradox that I've seen for some of our partners has been that they are receiving more funding from some organizations like Open Society Foundations, OSIWA, and ourselves. And at the same time, they're not able to spend as much of their budget as they would like to, because they're not able to travel, they're not able to host conferences. And so there's a narrative of organizations starving and not having enough funding. Yeah. And I think it's because they're scared that the funding is going to run out in the next couple of years. But the reality today, when I look at their financial documents, is that actually they have quite a bit of money in their bank accounts. And again, there's this mentality that our bank account should be at zero. When money comes in, we should spend it. At the end of the year, and no company thinks it like that. No foundation thinks like that. You need to have at least 3-4 months of runway for if something happens, you can continue to fund. So I hope that we can have honest conversations between civil society and donors to say, some of this money should be going, a lot of it should be going to organizational development, to just investing in the institution. And some of it needs to be investing in the future. It's okay to not spend everything right now. We need to be resilient for the future. So that's one suggestion, to have just frank conversations about reserves.
Absolutely fantastic, David. So I'm really picking up the importance going forward of flexible funding that allows people to invest in their organizations, invest in organizational effectiveness, to long-term funding, because as you said, some of the challenges that we're facing, these are not overnight issues, particularly when you're talking about systemic things. And the third is this open and frank conversations about the need to have reserves. Particularly when we live in such a VUCA world, it's almost how do you survive without these reserves? You need to be able to pivot in so many instances. So thank you for that, David. So Jeff, I'm about to come to you. And I'm going to do the same naughtiness I did with David. Haha. That very important question. Oh, yes.
Sorry to cut you. So David will be leaving us soon.
Okay.
I don't know if we have any questions, last comments for him. David, are you staying through?
I wish that I could. We have a year-end grant-making deadline. So the most important thing for me is to make sure that we get all this money out the door to the organizations that can do the great work. But I want to say thank you so much to you, Omolara Taka, for the invitation. Thank you to the interpreters. It was really wonderful to hear Ibrahima speaking in French. I'm mindful of another aspect of exclusion that is inherent in international development, that when I visit OSIWA's offices, Ibrahim is forced to speak in English because I don't speak French, and those types of barriers are unfair. Hopefully Google Translate will help in that. And it's great to see Rose and Jeff also. One thing that we've been trying to do is not perpetuate the usual tendency of Western donors to look toward Western development experts as to, how should we respond to COVID? I mean, Ibrahima addressed this very well. And so we have turned to a variety of leaders in African civil society. We've been publishing video vignettes on our blog, and Rose was one of the most eloquent in helping inform how we should be thinking about our longer term strategy. And it's great to see Jeff again as well. Jeff met when, and I met when Jeff had slightly less gray hair. I had less gray hair in my beard. At that time, I was able to represent the youth within philanthropy. That's no longer the case. And I realized, Taka, that I did not address your question about what to do in terms of this kind of the monopoly effect, the network effect, where more money goes to the same organizations. And I didn't respond to it because I don't have a great response. One policy that we have at Hewlett Foundation are term limits. We're not allowed to work for more than 8 years, and we don't have promotions. So I think that does attract a type of intrinsically motivated person who wants to do the good work more than kind of climb the ladder. And I think it's a good policy for a lot of civil society organizations to think about what's the appropriate amount of time to be leading, to be in a civil society organization. It's definitely more than 5 years. I think that it's probably less than 10 years. There's no magic number, but we do want to make sure that we encourage new generations, new ideas to come through our institutions. So thank you so much for having this conversation.
Thank you so much, David. Thanks again. Stay well.
Thanks, David. I'll be in touch. Stay in touch.
Thanks, David. Thanks a lot.
Okay, wonderful. So Jeff, back to your original question, and then I'm going to add another question on top of it. And it's really, again, I think your question was, as we have increased amounts of funding coming to COVID-related priorities, how do we ensure that we are not ignoring some of those very important basic priorities of civil society? But maybe the second question is, I would like to come back to a point that Rose raised about how we ensure, and maybe I don't know if this question is fair to you because you are the bank and she's talking about local philanthropy, but particularly it's how do we get funding for the kind of work that you normally would fund, so that we graduate from support from the bank. And she talked about it, the accountability work, the influencing policy work. And she says, you can't take a picture of your influencing work necessarily of how you change the policy. But what ideas, what models do you have to support organizations that you are currently supporting to graduate from support from you to increasingly get local support to do this very important accountability work? So over to you.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Taka. That's a $1 million question, because the reason we have a preponderance of foreign funding, even for traditional bread and butter service delivery, is that the local resource base has been somewhat limited and continues to be constrained, and it's not going to be helped by the COVID environment. So, for example, if you think of a country like the United Kingdom, the NGOs in the UK, whether it's Oxfam or Save the Children, can manage this tension between getting funding from the British government for their support of partners overseas, with getting resources for research and for accountability work at the same time. We don't have, I think the thing that we need to start pushing is whether our governance practices in Africa, whether governments can start to see the value of pro-accountability work of CSOs, or rather pro-public accountability work of CSOs, to raise its profile and understanding of its significance, and not just reduce CSOs to bread and butter service delivery partners. So once we start to see in parity the work on social accountability and the work on service delivery, perhaps certain government budgets, including, by the way, with the support of funding partners, developing partners, can be dedicated to the public monitoring of government institutions. That's one way to think about using government resources for eligible CSOs to go beyond provision of services into the kind of social accountability work. I think Rose might have a better view than I on the potential role of local philanthropy on this, which is really something that even from international perspective, we need to start thinking, how do we support that? But also to imagine ways in which organizations like us can include. So the GPSA gives grants to CSOs. We tend to provide core financing, core as in CORE, which goes beyond simply programming and supports capacity building and learning and kind of some of the institutional capacity aspects. They are not the longest term, it's only 3 to 5 years. So the thinking would be, can we imagine financing elements, financing components that also empower local or even global resource mobilizations? Because all of us on this call know that raising money itself is expensive. It doesn't come easy. So can we have budgets that can actually focus on enabling resource mobilization along with financing for the program and indeed for capacity strengthening and so on? These are all ideas that need to be on the table for people like us who are seeking ways to strengthen capacity, technical, financial, and sustainability of CSOs. Let me pause there.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jeff. Emmy, I wanted to ask a question to Ibrahima, but I want to check. Omolara, are there any other questions from the floor? And while we're checking, please do put I don't want to dominate the questions. Please put your questions in the chat or raise your hand. Ibrahima, you had responded to the question by Louise on inclusion, and unfortunately she dropped. The joys of internet, just as you ask the question, and when they're responding, then you drop. So just correct me if I've summarized. I think what I heard you say is you affirmed the importance of inclusion, the importance of advocating for government responses that are inclusive of vulnerable groups, such as people with disabilities, but also on the type of funding that OSIWA does. You're also mindful of these particular vulnerable groups. Did I summarize that right, Ibrahima?
Yes, correct.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, I'm still coming to you, Ibrahima. I still have a tough question for you, but I just want to see if there's any other questions from the floor or anybody with a raised hand.
No, Taka. So we don't have questions per se on the floor, except for comment. Jane had commented, she joined us from New York, and she had said that we need to keep on rethinking resilience strategies for CSOs. COVID has changed everything. I think this is very true. So I think we can move on. Colleagues, please, if you would like to take the floor, kindly raise your hand. I'm sure the hand button is somewhere. Sometimes I get lost myself. Or just drop a comment in the chat box. That's easy to be found. That I like to take the floor in case you can't find the raising hand button. Also to mention that I saw Nana somewhere. Now my ED joined somewhere. I can't find her again.
I see her there. There's a magazine. Hello, Nana, and welcome.
We also have our civil society representative at the ECOWAS in the room, Auntie Raimat. Raimat is in charge of civil society at the ECOWAS. She joined right from the beginning. So Raimat, good to see you. Thank you for joining. So Taka, over to you.
Raimat, welcome.
Thank you very much.
Okay. So Ibrahima, we're still thinking about funding models in the context of CSO sustainability. Yeah? And I think we're still trying to crack the question around how do we avoid the situation of certain CSO monopolies. I think David had some ideas, but it would be interesting to see how OSIWA is thinking about funding long-term in terms of indeed strengthening CSO sustainability, in terms of ensuring that you're going beyond the usual suspects on the continent, in terms of ensuring that you are not crowding out local philanthropy, which has emerged during this phase, and also ensuring that you are learning lessons around the flexibility and core funding. What is your thinking, Ibrahima?
Merci, Taka. Peut-être avant de répondre à cette question, faire quelques commentaires sur les questions précédentes. Je pense que ce que j'observe dans l'environnement du financement des organisations de la société civile, il y a un nombre important de donneurs, donc de bailleurs de fonds, y compris les nouveaux dans l'environnement là. Mais chaque bailleur avec ses exigences et qui disons, met un poids important sur les partenaires, sur la société civile en termes de capacité à répondre aux exigences des différents bailleurs. Ce qui fait que malgré la multiplicité des bailleurs, certaines organisations n'ont qu'un seul partenaire, un seul bailleur, parce qu'ils ne peuvent pas répondre aux exigences qui sont différentes les unes des autres en fonction des bailleurs, de tous ces bailleurs-là. Ils n'ont pas ces capacités techniques-là, ces ressources humaines-là pour répondre à toutes ces exigences. À mon avis, ça, c'est une contrainte forte qui fait que il est difficile pour les partenaires, les organisations de diversifier leurs sources de financement, ce qui est une forme de résilience et de soutenabilité pour elles. Si elles peuvent, disons, diversifier le financement. Et pour, disons, adresser cette question de capacité technique, je pense que il est important et je suis heureux que ce soit Waxi qui conduit donc ce webinaire pour, disons, prendre cet aspect-là en compte. Comment est-ce que, dans un contexte de multiplicité des bailleurs avec des exigences différentes, permettre aux organisations de la société civile de répondre pour diversifier leurs sources de financement. Parce que ça contribue à leur résilience, à leur truc. Donc, je pense que ça, c'est un problème qu'il faut souligner avec force. et aussi la question de la mobilisation des ressources domestiques. À mon avis, pas seulement du point de vue du gouvernement qui va lever, parce que bien avant le Covid, on est en train de pousser cette question de mobilisation des ressources domestiques pour réduire notre dépendance vis-à-vis de l'extérieur. Et donc, ce Covid-là a montré l'importance de cette souveraineté-là, aussi bien en termes de santé qu'en termes de financement et dans d'autres espaces. La Covid a montré l'importance de la souveraineté dans tous ces domaines-là pour réduire la dépendance de l'extérieur. Donc, cette fois-ci, avec la question du financement, pas seulement que nos gouvernements lèvent des ressources pour financer le secteur de la société civile, mais comment est-ce que la société civile elle-même peut imaginer à lever des ressources, mobiliser des ressources en interne avec des innovations. Moi, quand je pensais à ça, j'ai pensé au membership, j'ai pensé aux activités génératrices de revenus, sans pour autant aller dans le sens de faire du profit, puisque nous sommes des organisations non gouvernementales ou de la société civile dans un sens restrictif. Nous n'avons pas à faire des profits dans un sens restrictif, mais il y a des moyens pour lever des fonds au niveau domestique pour prendre en charge certaines questions et renforcer notre résilience, donc vis-à-vis des chocs extérieurs. J'ai bien apprécié aussi la proposition de David sur la nécessaire conversation entre les organisations de la société civile et les bailleurs pour, disons, influencer mutuellement notre programmation, nos stratégies, pour que la société civile, les bailleurs de fonds qui n'ont pas forcément le temps pour, disons, consulter suffisamment et prendre en compte les préoccupations des organisations de la société civile, puissent cette fois-ci prendre cette opportunité-là pour véritablement avoir ces informations-là et que la société civile aussi puisse, à cette occasion-là, saisir cette opportunité pour influencer les modalités et les pratiques de financement de leurs partenaires. Parce que ici, nous parlons de partenariat et pour que ce partenariat soit véritablement effectif, il faut qu'il y ait ce truc-là. Et à cette occasion-là, je voudrais, disons, inviter Waxy et David est parti, mais nous avons commencé un forum que j'ai trouvé intéressant qui pouvait, disons, prendre en compte cette préoccupation de mettre ensemble, d'élargir le Social Accountability Learning Forum, genre que nous avions par le passé organisé avec la coordination de Waxy et des partenaires comme Hewlett et Ford Foundation, pourrait être élargi parce que si la société civile doit organiser ce genre de conversation, ils vont se demander, bon, où est-ce qu'on va trouver encore des ressources? Est-ce que moi, par exemple, je suis prêt en tant que donneur de donner des ressources pour que la société civile vienne me dire, bon, voilà comment il faut faire. Bon, moi je suis suffisamment ouvert. Hein. Moi, j'organise chaque année des partner forums où je dis aux gens, bon, dites-moi où est-ce que le partenariat ne marche pas. Vous pouvez tout me dire. Donc, ça ne va pas remettre en cause mes relations de financement que j'ai avec vous. Donc, comme ça, pour construire donc, une seule relation de partenariat et prendre en compte effectivement les préoccupations de ces gens-là. Donc, pour revenir à la question de Taka, je pense que le financement, la viabilité à long terme est une question importante. Et en même temps, c'est un défi pour tout le monde. Je ne suis pas sûr qu'on a la solution toute faite, mais c'est cet engagement-là, disons, mutuel qui va nous permettre de déterminer où est-ce qu'il y a un besoin pour, disons, soutenir, puisque dans nos modalités de financement, dans nos formulaires de proposition, il y a toujours une section qui dit soutenabilité. Il faut nous montrer la soutenabilité de l'organisation. Et là, qu'est-ce qu'on en fait? Il n'y a pas un seul partenaire que nous avons. Par exemple, nous, à Osiwa, nous avons des centaines de partenaires et dans chaque formulaire de proposition, il y a une section entière soutenabilité qui fait partie des critères de financement. Pas que si tu n'es pas soutenable, on ne va pas te financer, mais on veut comprendre comment est-ce que tu es soutenable ou que tu n'es pas soutenable pour qu'on puisse, disons, renforcer cette soutenabilité. Donc, mais dans la réalité, entre la théorie et le remplissage du formulaire et la pratique pour amener les organisations à être soutenables, je pense qu'il y a un gap. Et donc, nous avons tous la responsabilité de questionner donc, cet aspect-là de façon beaucoup plus approfondie pour adresser véritablement la question de la soutenabilité, parce que ce n'est pas en remplissant le formulaire et puis après quoi. Et puis voilà, ça fait plus de 20 ans qu'on est en train de soutenir et personne n'est soutenable. Right? Et donc, ça, c'est un problème. Et donc, pour terminer, Taka, sur votre question, un aspect, disons, comment est-ce que la variété des partenaires pour qu'il n'y ait pas seulement, as you said, usual suspect. Donc, nous, ce que nous avons fait est que, bon, c'est vrai, on a un call proposal qui est là et qui est transparent, que tout le monde peut regarder, et on a des critères d'évaluation qui sont concurrentiels, mais aussi on a une approche proactive engagement qui normalement doit, disons, adresser ce déficit pour que c'est pas seulement les mêmes partenaires qu'on est en train de financer pendant 10, 20 ans, les mêmes partenaires et on met de côté. Et nous avions mis en place l'année dernière une stratégie volontariste pour soutenir les plus petites organisations, les organisations communautaires de base, qui ne peuvent pas, par exemple, répondre à nos critères de financement. Par exemple, on veut que l'organisation ait un conseil d'administration. On veut que l'organisation ait une comptabilité bien faite. On veut que l'organisation... Or, donc, les petites organisations qui sont en contact direct avec les communautés que nous voulons renforcer ne remplissent pas forcément ces critères. Et nous avons désigné spécifiquement des méthodes pour travailler avec ce genre d'organisations qui n'ont pas à remplir ces critères formels que nous avons mis en place pour les grandes organisations. Merci.
Wonderful. Merci beaucoup, Ibrahima. Really captured very comprehensively some of the key issues raised. And I'm going to come to Rose now, because there's something that Ibrahima said that was very telling, that I think it would be very interesting to unpack. What's emerging from this conversation are clearly a list of good practices that donors, funding organizations should use as they support civil society in a way that civil society organizations can be more sustainable. And we've talked about them, the flexibility, all of that. Huh? But I think what Ibrahima raised is, for instance, for them, the importance of getting the feedback in order to know what are the best ways to do these practices. But I would like for you to respond to, Rose, the issue of unequal power relationships. And I think Ibrahima alluded to this, how people might be afraid, CSOs might be afraid of, hey, if I actually tell this not all organizations are like Osiwa that will take feedback kindly. Others might be shining one eye thinking, oh, okay. So Rose, what have you seen in your work with CSOs as being particularly effective in influencing, particularly those hard-trenched donors, in influencing funders to shift their practices to be more responsive to CSOs? Anything you've seen that we can learn from?
Wow. Big question, huh? Big question. Yeah, I think maybe just to start, and how I think about this question about what needs to happen. I think looking on the civil society side, clearly, yeah, we feel it. The power dynamics. It's real. It's real, and especially given that for me to get a grant, I have to fulfill all these conditions. Now I can't start saying that I can't fulfill them because then I won't get any money. So that's a real. It's a situation that really, I think, impinges in a very negative positions. The other observation is that most program officers who are the ones who you're interacting with as a CSO, they are usually technical experts. They're not experts in organizational development, for example. Yeah. So we find that they're very interested in the program. What are you going to do about, reducing domestic violence? I want to know about the program. Whether you have an accountant is something that's really boring to them. And yet, these requirements, they could be lighter, but I think they're important, because how do you demonstrate accountability if you're not keeping records of how you're using money that has been given to you, and that you're assuring that there's going to be good stewardship? Whether you're a small organization or a big organization, I think it's important that one of the good practices is that you do take care of, money that has been, awarded, especially I think for organizations that are in the space where we are calling for transparency in government, accountability in government, that we ourselves have to absolutely be above any questions about, particularly around money. But also, and again, going to the nature of the space and going back to who are you interacting with, is that we find that oftentimes funders, and I think David alluded to this, funders as well as CSOs themselves are much more excited about the program. Really hundreds, if not thousands, of convenings that happen around a particular issue, but very little thinking or examination of what kind of institutions are we building, and to bring the best minds around how do you build a good organization. I mean, they're experts on these issues, but we rarely bring them into our space. And yet, for me, and what excites me about doing the work that I do is that, unlike some of the intractable problems that we're trying to solve, that we may never solve, even if we do become less poor or more wealthy, these problems keep evolving. Even the so-called developed countries still have issues of healthcare and education. They'll never end. But we know how to build an organization, so why don't we just do it? And I think, putting in those pillars, I think needs to be really front and center, and particularly with what COVID has revealed, that you could be doing a good program, but if you don't have those organizational pillars, that resilience that we're talking about, that strategic ability to pivot, you're not going to survive, and that wonderful work that you're doing is actually threatened. So to me, it's not either or. I think we have to start seeing these two sides of an organization as very intricately interwoven, and that we got to address them both. So that brings me to the other concept, capacity building, which we hear over and over again. And what capacity building has meant in our sector, mostly it's sort of one-off, training, a week here, a week there for your financial manager, for your communications manager, but not a strategic, it's not seen as a strategic investment. That actually your success in your program depends on your capacity to actually deliver on that program. And therefore to see it as something that is part and parcel of your program, and a never-ending process, because there are new technologies coming on board, there's new knowledge, new research, and that these programs have to be accompanied by that sort of capacity building, particularly in terms of enabling organizations to develop what I would call sort of a strategic ability and adaptability, ability to be scanning the landscape. So even with COVID, right now, if you ask many groups, they're like, oh, there's no money, but actually there is money. There is still money flowing. Do they know where it is? Very few groups have that ability to, like here in Senegal, I know, USAID is about to, they're kind of in their transition year. They have 2 huge grants coming in. People have lined up, the usual suspects who are bidding, and there's not a single Senegalese group in those consortia. So do we know how to be part of a consortium? So I think that there's a lot of things that we could be done. It's not all, to me, it's not all gloom and doom, but there's certain capacities that we really need to help the sector to gain. Yeah.
Brilliant, brilliant. Thank you. Really useful, Rose. So, I would have loved to continue this conversation all day because I think there's so much to explore, but I recognize we're coming to the top of the hour where we need to be wrapping up. I'm just going to ask each of our panelists to just give us 2 seconds, final remarks, and then I will sum up and we will try and end on time. So Jeff, if I may start with you very quickly, your closing thoughts.
Yeah. Thanks, Taka, and thank you everyone for taking the time. First, I think we need to underscore that the donor landscape is diverse. There are private donors and official donors. Private donors may have greater agility, flexibility than official donors. What's at stake is the capacity of CSOs at the country level, individually and collectively, to engage, negotiate, and clamor for that space for adaptability, for flexibility in direct dialogue with development partners. Both donors are impacted by COVID, and there are spillover effects on CSOs in terms of limitation of funding. That is why we must all work relentlessly at figuring out what are those alternative avenues for resource mobilization. I like the conversation about local resource mobilization. Even though it has limitations, it has scope, including, by the way, our own national governments and how they should support CSOs beyond service delivery into what one would call the governance arena, which includes transparency, accountability, and participation. Finally, I think the issue of capacity does deserve a lot of attention, and it needs to go beyond individual skills, beyond an organization, and into institution capacity building, which is strengthening the CSO as a sector in order to increase its capacity for influence, to influence governments, to influence donors, and to strengthen policy engagement in order to change rules that favor CSOs and strengthen their capacity. Let me stop there. Otherwise, thank you very much for having me.
Brilliant. Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jeff. Really enjoyed your thoughts and perspectives. Thank you, Jeff. Ibrahima, your closing thoughts?
Je pense que j'ai mis toutes mes réflexions sur la table et Jeff m'a marché aussi sur la langue. Mais peut-être ajouter un seul élément. Je pense qu'on a fait beaucoup de renforcement de capacité, mais il est toujours nécessaire de renforcer les capacités des organisations de la société civile, particulièrement non seulement pour mobiliser les ressources, mais même pour, disons, adapter les stratégies en fonction du changement de contexte. Nous sommes dans un contexte qui change rapidement avec des chocs extérieurs. Comment est-ce que pour rester pertinent à répondre aux défis nouveaux, comment est-ce qu'on peut changer et ne pas rester dans un truc classique comme ça, qui fait qu'on peut se trouver rapidement en dehors des possibilités de financement qui existent. Parce que si on n'est pas pertinent et qu'on ne répond pas aux défis, ça n'a pas de sens de continuer. Je pense que, et là, nos organisations de la société civile ont beaucoup de limitations dans ce domaine-là, malgré les sessions de renforcement de capacité qu'on donne. Donc, moi, je pense qu'à ce niveau-là, il est important d'articuler mieux donc ces formations-là à ces niveaux-là, en plus de ce que Jeff a dit. Merci.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ibrahima, and thank you so much for your thoughts and perspectives in this conversation. Rose, finally, over to you. Final thoughts, comments?
Sure. I think for me, it's just to say that I think for me, this is a moment of great hope. I believe, the sector will come out stronger. It'll be different. Maybe it'll be smaller. I don't know, but it's definitely a moment. Our recent survey, and one of the other things that did surprise us is actually the optimism that CSOs seem to have, and they mentioned several opportunities that they see emerging from this crisis, and I'll just quickly run over them. And the first one is around reorienting their operations. I mean, we saw that they were able to pivot very quickly. So it is possible. And many of them, despite the challenges of working from home, initially said that they would actually consider that as part of how they operate. It would reduce costs in some cases. You don't have to rent a huge office, etc. They also saw an opportunity to accelerate digital transformation. I think our sector has been quite slow, and for many reasons, to adapt to the digital age, and that again could bring greater efficiency and perhaps some cost savings as well. They also mentioned an opportunity for strengthening advocacy, particularly if they can come together, heal some of the fragmentation in the sector, so that groups can start to speak, not necessarily in one voice, but certainly across common issues and common challenges, that they can act as a sector, and they strengthen in numbers in that way. Another opportunity is that, the improving visibility, that to really to make visible initially, or not initially, but including to their citizens of their countries and to their government, around what difference they're making and the important work that they do, and how that in fact can help propel many of our development goals and plans as countries and as a continent. And in the other opportunities around building sector solidarity, which I think I mentioned in terms of healing the fragmentation, reinforcing relevance and credibility, so that ordinary people, there'll be people who cry when an organization dies, that will miss it and will do whatever they can to make sure that little community group in their community is not going to die, because it's serving such an important role. And of course, then we talked about maybe this is an opportunity also to really push further the ongoing debate around shifting power. There's a movement, I'm not sure how serious it is, around localization. And as we saw with international NGOs leaving or having cuts in their budgets, etc., there's clearly a space now to step into and to push for localization. But we need to be ready for that, right? Yes. And then of course the last one is this whole issue of leveraging domestic funding sources. So I think there are opportunities, and I hope that for funders, Ibrahima, Jeff, and others, that there's some quick wins. Of course, there are longer term issues as well, but some of these things are actually very doable, so let's some action. That's the challenge I guess I'm throwing to funders in this space. Let's do something. Let's start with it easy and doable, and then
Wonderful. I think you've summarized it really well, Rose. Thank you so much. I think you're talking about action, and we know what we need to take action on. We've heard today about the importance of flexible funding. We have heard about the importance of core funding. We've talked about also the value of long-term funding, because the issues that CSOs are dealing with are often systemic. They take time. We've also talked about having open and frank discussions about having reserves, and being able to have resources that one can count on difficult times. We've talked about how we ensure that our funding does not create monopolies of organizations, but that we're also putting in place systems such as OSIWA to ensure that smaller, less visible organizations also have equal opportunities to the increased funding that's available. We've talked about influencing governments to also value the type of accountability work that CSOs are doing. And we've talked about how we need to continue to nurture and build on the local philanthropy that we have seen emerging. We've talked about the value of CSOs coming together to influence donors and donor practices, and continuing to engage those donor staff, such as the ones you mentioned, Rose, who are more interested in primarily pragmatic and not necessarily organizational development issues. And finally, we talked about the importance of developing the capacity within civil society organizations to adapt, to scan the environment, to be agile, and to ultimately also influence the funding environment. So this has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you again, once again, to our panelists. We truly appreciate your thoughts, your perspectives. Thank you to our participants. We value, otherwise we'll just be having a conversation ourselves. So your presence really matters. And of course, to WAXI for taking the leadership and initiative on this issue. So back to you, Omolara, to close us out.
Thank you so much, Taka. I think for Taka and the speakers, please, can we unmute our mics and just give them a round of applause? They need to hear this. Unmute your mics and just clap. Thank you so much, Taka. I mean, you did a fantastic job.
Thank you very much.
I want to be like you. So seriously, I've told you this one-on-one, and I'm saying it publicly again. I mean, you inspire a lot of us a lot, and we so appreciate the work that you do, the strength, your knowledge, your versatility, dynamism, I mean, everywhere and everything. Thank you so much, Taka, for creating this time to facilitate these sections for us. To all the speakers, thank you so much. We knew we got it right this time more than ever. And you need to see how we celebrated your confirmation to be on this panel as WAXI. Like, this is a great panelist, you know, and we're so happy for all the insight that you have shared. We will be coming your way again soon to all participants and everybody in the room this time next month, where we're going to be looking at the 6th series of this COVID webinar. We're not sure of the topic now, but I can tell you we are still exploring the impact of COVID on the work that civil society is doing across West Africa. So we'll be looking at another interesting dimension. However, on Friday, this Friday, that will be 2nd, I believe, of October, WAXI started an initiative with some of our partners to increase or to amplify civil society's voices and involvement in the crisis that is going on in Mali. So on Friday, we're going to be having another webinar to really, mobilize solidarity across the continent this time and ensure that we support our constituents in Mali, the people of Mali, like we had discussed in the past. The crisis in Mali now is beyond Mali, and it is our business, and we have to get involved. And if you scan across the region, you can see similar situation brewing across some other countries like Ivoire, like Guinea. So we can say conveniently that our democracy is in jeopardy in this region. And we cannot wait for things to get out of hand before we start taking action. So on Friday, we'll be sharing the link to the webinar with you to hear your thoughts. I'm happy because all of us here are experts and we are interested in the democracy, development, and human rights sustainability of this region and indeed the continent. So we'd like to tap into your wealth of knowledge and expertise. So we'll be happy to see all of you on Friday to join us for that webinar. So once again, I want to thank everyone, the interpreters, please thank you so much for the excellent work. The speakers, thank you. Taka, thank you. WAXI team, I love you guys. And you can't do anything about it. I just love you. Thank you so much to Waxy Communication teams, participants from all over the world. We have people joining us from Canada, Nigeria, United States. Thank you so much for joining, and see you next month. But of course, see you on Friday first, okay? Have a good evening. Thank you. Goodbye. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Well done.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye.